Let's talk a little bit more about escrow holdbacks. So if a seller doesn't perform and does not actually finish whatever the task is that they're supposed to do when there's a holdback, who would receive the funds?
Okay, so basically you're getting to a crossroads where you are maybe at the walkthrough or something was supposed to be taken care of, whether it's a result of the home inspection or what have you, and now that wasn't actually taken care of.
Right.
So this is the biggest fundamental difference between a closing and escrow, we mentioned previously, and a escrow holdback. When you decide to do an escrow holdback, you're deciding to move forward on the closing happening, right? So you are transferring title, but perhaps taking possession of the property, funds are being dispersed and items are being recorded, which means that there's still something that's left to be done, but folks are wanting to move forward with the closing, okay? So the most important thing when it comes to an escrow holdback is making sure your escrow holdback agreement that is written up and approved by all parties is very specific on a few different factors. One being what needs to be done and by whom. Typically it's a seller. We have a line item on the closing disclosure that's going to relate to what that seller needs to finish in order for funds to be received. We need to account for how much funds are going to be held back, right? It's important that if you have an estimate for something that perhaps you are accounting for a little bit more than that estimate. There also needs to be accountability for what happens if the amount due is over and above what has already been estimated and what is already being held as that line item. What happens now, right? That agreement should speak to that most definitely. It should speak to when do the funds go back to the seller, if they are supposed to go back to the seller, how do they go back to the seller? When does the buyer decide to tell the closing company who's holding those funds that it's now okay to be releasing those funds? Your escrow holdback agreement has to be very particular on addressing anything that may go differently than what folks are thinking will happen, right? There's always a risk in real estate. And as professionals, we can walk through the consumer through those risks, but we can never take out the risk in real estate. So as a buyer and seller, you are going to be making decisions that are risk factors, whether you close in escrow, which means you haven't yet closed yet because you want something to still needs to be done. But that means you might not be moving in and folks aren't getting keys, they're not dispersing funds, they're not recording. Or do you do an escrow holdback where you do transfer title, funds are dispersed except for the amount that's being held back by the seller's funds pursuant to a closing escrow holdback agreement that everybody is agreeing to, right? So both come with a little bit of a risk factor. It's up to the buyer and seller to decide what is best for them in that situation in order to move forward.
Makes sense. Yes.
I think we find a lot of times that everybody's so excited at the closing and they just want to get their keys. They just want to move in. The moving truck's already there.
It's the domino effect, right?
Yeah, they have their family and friends coming later that afternoon. Things are happening. They don't want to wait. So it's our job to figure out what is the best way for everybody to move forward.
Absolutely. I think that escrow agreement being as detailed as possible with what is the amount being held back, what happens if the amounts owed are over and above that, when do the funds get returned to the seller, how do they get returned to the seller, what's that process look like, making sure that you're accounting for everything that might happen, even if it won't, right?
Every possible scenario,
because that is the risk in real estate, right?
Absolutely,
We've seen it all.
Thank you so much, Kelly.
Thanks, Kelly.
Of course.